Welcome to Keeping the World Company on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today, we'll talk about how far down the path are we to the end of the liberal world order. What is the end state of our de-democratization? Our co-host for the show is Ben Davis. Our esteemed guest for the show is Gene Rosenfeld, independent scholar. Welcome to the show, both of you. It's harder and harder to force ourselves to follow the news, but follow it we must, since it is taking us all to another place, the whole world to another place, which will undoubtedly affect our society and quality of life. Ben, let me ask you first. We have somebody who wants to be a dictator. How far has he gotten on a continuum of getting there? What are the indicia of his success at becoming a dictator?
I think he's gotten pretty far, since the next study, there's a group that looks at democracy, a democracy index, I think in London, and they're looking at dropping the United States off their list this year, which is a remarkable development in 2 months. If we try to look at the sources of power in our government or in our country, so if we look towards Congress, as everyone will know, Congress is supinely compliant with him. So they're just basically doing his work, and the Speaker of the House is really just a person who is like a hired hand, which, when you've known of speakers in the past having a lot of autonomy, is really quite shocking. With regard to the courts are playing a role, but they need cases to come in, and they're still, I think, some people are placing maybe too high a hope in the federal courts. When we look into business, the sense of the business community is that they are bending the knee rapidly, even before he came into power. When we look at the media seems to be bending the knee, at least what we call the legacy media, in terms of complying with him. I wouldn't say that the alternative media is so much there like us, but certainly the legacy media, with changes in lineups and things like that, are showing a lot of deference, because there's threats to their licenses that are being made. There seems to be a normalization of a lot of encouraging of fear and indifference to the formal norms or the formal requirements of the law. So really, maybe I should add the trying to do government by decree, right? Which these decrees that he's doing are not really consistent with the actual law. But I remember seeing him telling the governor of Maine that he was the law, which kind of sounds a little dictatorial in my sense. So I think he's moved fairly rapidly along. There is dissent in the streets and all that stuff, but if you look at the sort of places of power, they seem to all be bending towards him as opposed to bending away from him.
Well, you remember, Ben, l'état c'est moi. That was Louis XVI, I think. The state is me. It's hauntingly similar, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. He was called the Sun King, and if you look at how he's redecorated, I think garishly, the Oval Office with all this gold and all that, it's really quite sickening to me. But that's just me looking at it and having a sense of its grandeur. As in its simplicity, it had a certain grandeur. Now it just looks like, I don't know, looks pretty goldly garish to me. That's just my personal view.
Like Trump Tower, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
Gene, let's talk about manifest destiny, and somehow manifest destiny relates to this. He really is serious, or so it seems, about acquiring Canada, Greenland, Panama, and being involved in issues and initiatives all over the world without putting boots on the ground. He has ended soft power and smart power, that we had for 70 or 80 years. He's ended USAID and the influence of the United States in so many places, not only in the global South, but around the world. And his involvement in the Ukraine peace discussions. How does this play out? How does it play out in Israel and in the Middle East in general, where there's so many conflicts going on? And so China and Taiwan. So the reason I'm mentioning all these is that, they reflect his apparent desire to be the most famous person in the world, the most authoritative person in the world, the leader of the world, not just the free world, to carve up the world in his own image. So where does, when you look at the manifest destiny and his statements about acquiring all these places and being involved, being a player in all these issues, what does that tell us about how far down the path we are to the end of the liberal world order?
Manifest destiny, as you know, was a 19th century idea before we were a continental nation state. And manifest destiny was coined in order to explain why we were pushing out indigenous people as we moved west, as European settlers and descendants of the original settlers moved west, particularly after the Civil War, when a lot of people from the South were searching for a new beginning for themselves in the West. So that drive was completed when we reached the Pacific Ocean. Subsequent to that, what we engaged in is rightly called imperialism. The acquisition on the Spanish-American War of the Philippines and Cuba, the acquisition of Hawaii in 1898, the acquisition of Pacific Islands territories, and after World War II, the acquisition of Guam and islands closer to Japan. What's remarkable about the United States in terms of imperialism, and it's been accused of being an imperialist power by the Soviet Union, is that we gave back most of what we took. We did keep Samoa, and we did keep um, a few Caribbean islands, but we gave back Cuba, we gave back the Philippines, we gave autonomy to the Marshall Islands. This is unique, and this is part of what our conception of the liberal world order is, which is to allow peoples to have self-determination. This is not something that any imperial power has ever allowed its dependent territories. What we are seeing now is a re-engagement with imperialism on the part of Trump. Independently, he's an anomaly, he's a black swan. And I'm not ready yet to say that we are at the end of a liberal world order, because Europe has the opportunity to take up that banner and to continue it. And we also have to wait and see how long Trump can continue down this path when the judicial branch of the government is still opposing him and reversing what he is trying to do, which is a mythological dream of an extreme ethno-nationalist New World Order from people like Aryan nations and the underbelly of American culture. It's an anomaly. So we have to see how long he's going to be president. I mean, we have a midterm coming up. That's essentially a referendum on his powers. And it's possible that impeachment could still be on the table if that referendum goes against him. So we are in the middle of the struggle right now. We have not yet overturned the liberal world order. Germany, France, the UK, Italy have the opportunity to restore it or to continue it while we are experiencing a ridiculous, absurd attempt at an authoritarian coup.
Ben, you spent a fair amount of time in Europe, and I'm sure you're watching what's going on there. There's some people that feel, although Gene does not feel that the liberal world order is already done, some people feel that it is done. that we no longer have it. And there are those that feel that we're actually in World War III. World War III was bound to be different than 1 and 2 because of technology, because of the way the world is configured. But some people feel we're already in a kind of world war. And some people have advanced the notion that we, the United States, we were going to lose the liberal world order anyway. It's been getting old. It's been getting tattered at the edges in Europe. And so, do you agree with those things? What do you think the status of the liberal world order is right now? What do you think the status of the liberal world order is right now? Were we going to lose it anyway? Are we in a world war of sorts right now? Your thoughts?
I think we are at a minimum with the approach that's being done right now, moving away from an American dominant liberal world order. And the question is going to be to what extent there is a European led world order or not. And there are forces trying to push against, uh, and basically pushing towards autocracy in Europe too. But that is still out. For example, when the new prime minister of Canada took his first foreign trip, normally he would come to the United States to meet with the president of the United States. This time around, he went to France first, which some people are saying is Macron is now the head of the liberal world order as he tries to muster all those forces together. But yes, that the United States would not be dominant is certain. I mean, our real high point was when 1945, 1946, when we were like 50% of the entire world's production or something like that. And now there are many more entities and strong ones, like the second largest economy in China, that have the wherewithal to generate their own kind of spaces or in competition with the United States, that seems to be kind of moving towards a retreat. So yes, there's definitely shifts in the world that are going on. There's also, a lot of contradictions that have never been resolved. One of the things that I really appreciated when the Berlin Wall came down was a gentleman I used to work with named Alain Planté, who was a member of the Conseil d'Etat and all that. He said that the consequences of the Berlin Wall coming down would take another 50 years to sort out. And so we are now in around year 30 or so, a little bit 35 of that. And I think that there is a certain amount of that is going on. Also, there are contradictions because with the climate change, whatever the reasons are, the large numbers of immigrants, maybe they're not refugees, but they're desperate because the farms don't work anymore back home. And there's, the contradictions of neocolonialism are playing out with the immigrant move. So this liberal world order, which was kind of had its inherent contradictions, is confronted with some of the realities that it also helped create or keep going with regards to immigrants from the South coming up to the North. On the other hand, there is some kind of dynamism all across the South of a certain kind. I don't know all of it, but so there are these movements like what we call BRICS movement and things like that, which seems to be the current version of what used to be called the non-aligned movement, that are creating different kinds of structures. But I saw a recent study that seemed to say that the number of authoritarian states has just gone to a majority over the number of democratic states in the world. So there, something is going on that says that there is change in the air. Whether the change will be for the good or not is dependent on what leaders of countries decide to do. And right now here in the United States, it's not looking too good.
Gene, one of the things that the emerging new coalition in Europe is doing is rearming. They're spending more money on weapons, at least as much as Trump wanted them to spend, and they're rearming. So the liberal democratic countries in Europe are going to be better armed. And there's even talk of giving nuclear bombs to Germany. And I suggest to you that the better armed those countries are, the more likely it will move further to the right and war. How do you feel about the tinderbox effect of building a Europe where more money is being spent on weapons?
I compare what's happening now to the late 1930s and the buildup to the Second World War. As you know, I have contended for some time that we really are in World War III. If you look at World War II, it's debatable where it actually started. I mean, kinetically, the military portion of it, you might say, started in 1939. But in fact, from 1933 on, when Hitler achieved power, there were alignments happening, and there were aggressions and buildups. He was secretly building and arming Germany while saying he was pursuing peace. What we have here is a similar situation now, except it's hybrid. We know that the Russians, for a long time, have had a very coherent philosophy and strategy of changing the world order, of dethroning the United States and the West, of squeezing Europe. And now they have Trump on one side as a bookend, and Russia and China on the other side as a bookend, and they are squeezing Europe by threatening Ukraine, because everyone knows if Russia wins the negotiation over Ukraine with Trump, that he will invade the Baltics next. So we are close to kinetic war, potentially. And the United States has now changed sides. This did not happen in 1933, except that Italy joined Hitler, of course. But we are in a weird situation here. And by saying we're in the late 1930s by analogy, what I mean is I sense that if we continue down the same path internationally that we're in now, withdrawing from NATO, withdrawing our support from Ukraine, aligning with countries like Belarus and Hungary, and to be very honest, Israel has also become an authoritarian country. We are risking a bloody conflict. The United States is extremely divided. We have not been this divided since before the Civil War. I do not believe that the United States will passively sit by, the population will passively sit by while Trump becomes aligned with Russia in empowering Russia and China to assume leadership in the world. And what I mean by that is that the conflicts we're seeing now and the resistance we're seeing now will become violent. We have a history of turning violent. And that will also spill over into the international sphere as well. So yes, we are at risk of war. The rearmament of Europe also was a bellwether for World War II because they were caught unawares, and they're caught unawares now. So we are risking World War III, and we are in a hybrid World War III and preparing down the line for a kinetic World War III right now.
If I can just jump on what Gene said there, I absolutely, Gene, and on the hybrid point, it was occurring to me that this kind of cyber war or disinformation wars that we've been watching for a number of years here in the States and across Europe, of trying to destabilize the democracies. In a sense, you could say that Trump's election was a win for the Russian disinformation campaign in a cyber war, in a hybrid kind of war. Non-kinetic, but still a significant battlefield win, if you could say it like that. So that's what struck me in listening to your comment.
Well, Ben, I was going to ask you about the structures that were put in place after World War II, namely the United Nations, bless its soul, and NATO, and later on the Common Market and the EU. So it strikes me that those structures are really also tattered. Trump has done a lot to undermine NATO. And for that matter, the United Nations. The United Nations is really of no force or effect anymore. And what we have is the structures that were created to ensure a liberal world order, if you will, are no longer functioning. I mean, who can say that Article 5 would work right now? I mean, rhetorical question. The Russians attack Estonia after they finish with Ukraine. Would the United States, a member of NATO, come to Estonia's aid? And the answer is probably not. So NATO, which is centering on Article 5, is probably no longer an efficient organization or one that can be relied on. And the notion of allies, in the Western alliance, if you will, those allies are no longer allies with the United States. Maybe you could consider some of the democracies in Western Europe as allies, but not with the United States. Trump, has torn that asunder recently. And the notion of protecting sovereignty, national security, not invading your neighbor, that also was it came out of World War II. Before World War II, a lot of countries would attack their neighbors, but after World War II, we've had precious little of that until now. So this new liberal world, the old liberal world order, has been replaced by a new world order, it seems to me, which favors the strong, which doesn't favor the weak. They have to go along to get along, or get along to go along, just like the phenomena we see in this country over Trump's new kind of government. And these big players are essentially dividing up the world. And when you look at the tariffs, that's part of it. The tariffs are sort of an economic way to divide up the world, and the tariffs have economic effects and will have extraordinary economic effects going forward. So if we don't have these institutions that can preserve the liberal world order, where are we going? What's the end state of this devolution?
When I watched this, what's going on, I saw basically the way I saw it was that there were three essential spheres of influence that would be China in the Asia area, Russia in the European area, and the United States for the Americas. And then there would be, kind of the classic late 19th century battle for control of Africa and the resources of Africa as part of that. I mean, that the sort of like a spheres of influence vision. As I keep listening to you and Gene, when you brought up the United Nations, I saw that somebody did an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal saying we needed to get rid of the United Nations because it had been, quote unquote, screwing the United States. And so, one thing that I wonder about is, will there come a time with Trump where he will say that we need to renegotiate the host agreement between the United States and the United Nations for its offices to be in New York? That it's, to me, that's sort of like unimaginable. That's like I thought that the Berlin Wall coming down was unimaginable, but the fact that I just saw that opinion piece made me start to wonder. Now, if you look at the UN as a structure, what was the key to it? It was the five guarantors, right? At the time, it was Taiwan. Note, Taiwan Soviet Union, United States, France, and Britain, right? Where are we at now? Well, Taiwan is now mainland China, right? So those mainland China and Soviet Union is now Russia. So, okay. And then you have the United States, which is aligning itself with China and the Russians. So you have three of the five guarantors are leaning some one way, and then you have Britain and France that have kind of diminished in terms of their role in the world, except symbolically, over the period of time. So what has emerged? Well, we had the G7, we had the G8, that was becoming kind of a center of dialogue, right? And then now we have BRICS on the other side as a center of dialogue. NATO, yes, but in the context of containing the Soviet Union, it had its vitality. I was reading recently, the United States was talking about giving up command of NATO. So to have NATO not be under American command, which was kind of one of the hearts of the American defense that NATO is based on with the Article 5, is essentially turning NATO into a European structure with European control. I would disagree on one thing, which is the European Union. The European Union, I think, it was primarily generated by French and German dynamics. They've been, the European coal and steel agreement in the 50s, which was, the whole idea of that was not about coal and steel. It's that you needed coal and steel to create arms. And so if we could make an agreement on that, we would hopefully keep peace in Europe, right? And so I see that as a similar type structure, but a more organically European structure than sort of an American dominated structure. The problem with the European Union is, you create, people have an idea, they create an institution has got power, and then the question is power for what, right? What is the European Union's power for? And they haven't seen themselves as military powers except in their former colonies, quite honestly. But inside of the European space, it really has been looked at more as an economic entity as opposed to sort of a military entity. There are some other European structures that were sort of latent in the background at different points in time. They tried to build them into military structures, or they talked about doing it. But in terms of building an actual military presence, Europe is not in that space now. So, yes, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the UN's role has been dissipating. Absolutely. Remember, it was a space of dialogue, right? It was a space of dialogue. That was a key thing about the UN. Instead of having the great powers where they would meet in their capitals, it was a space that where every state was equal and they could speak. And so the principles that were there were, are still powerful principles. But now you have the great powers basically, going from maybe a G7 vision to maybe like a G3, which is the US, Russia, and China. That's all. And they will dictate to the rest of the world the way things are supposed to happen, with maybe a little bit, maybe a G4 would be to have Saudi Arabia in there, and the European Union be a G5, but really not clear what role the European Union would play in that kind of structure. And there seems to be a move that way. We get rivalry, and then what do you get? We get another horrific war, right? Kinetic, horrific war.
Europe has had trouble making joint decisions. People say that the EU is overregulated and that they have trouble agreeing on things. And to wit, their response to the Ukraine invasion does not speak of real solidarity. They could have saved Ukraine a long time ago, but actually they didn't. And so you wonder what would happen if they were left to their own devices without the United States, without the weapons from the United States, without the intelligence from the United States, without the money and support of NATO. And I agree with you. I think the UN is over. So, Gene, let me put it to you. Is the future? What is the end state of all of this? Can Europe survive, or will Europe simply be merged into a G3 new world order?
As the United States system of government goes, so goes the world. Battle is being joined here in the United States. If Trump finishes out a 4-year term and his successor adopts his national sovereignty view and isolationism, then what Ben has outlined may come to pass. The world may be divided up into spheres of influence dominated by powers that are basically military. Russia is a weak power outside of its military. North Korea is a weak power outside of its military. The only genuine strong power outside of the United States is China. And we would do very well to increase our rivalry, but friendly rivalry with China, and to admit it into our world order. But still, what I'm saying is we will know in 3 years the way the world is going to go, because it's going to depend on where the most powerful and financially able country in the world goes, the United States. And we already have Trump engaged in a trade war. He already is showing signs of being militarily independent, of decoupling from Europe, of decoupling from Russia, even in terms of military might. But then that leaves the world full of strong men of great powers that are eyeing one another. And that's an unstable situation. What the United States has done post World War II with Europe is put stability back into the world, financially, militarily, and socially. That is being torn down. And only because of a weird thing that happened in the United States. Not that the GOP hasn't been moving in this direction for decades. It has. It has wanted to privatize government. The religious right has wanted God to rule, not agencies, and not a civil government. So they're tearing that down. This is insane. And the person in charge of it right now, quite literally, is insane. He is a non-social human being, and he cannot govern a society. And the more the United States wakes up to this, and the press, the legacy press, which should know better, stops interviewing people like Alexander Dugin, the fascist philosopher, without identifying him as a fascist philosopher of Russia, then we are going to be in a holding pattern until we wake up in a new kind of woke and get rid of this guy and get rid of this movement.
Well, before we do that, before we get to that part of our discussion, let me ask you this. You suggest that maybe all of this is a kind of inevitability, that the world was moving this way, maybe the US was moving this way long before Trump. But I ask you, hasn't Trump exacerbated and accelerated this process? I mean, the steps he has taken only in the last few weeks seems to me have accelerated the move away from the liberal world order and to a new world order based on power. Do you agree with that, or do you think that it would have happened the same way anyway?
No, in 2011, I wrote in a published introduction to a right-wing classic, Tabernacle of Hate, written by Carrie Noble, who was the propaganda minister in a cult that originated the idea of the Oklahoma City bombing, which then was carried out by a confrere of theirs. I wrote that these are the elements you need for a fascist takeover in the United States. You need a charismatic leader. You need the ideology of what was then the underbelly, the radical anti-government right, and you needed the mass. This was a small group. These were small groups. They were extreme groups. But then you needed the mass population of the religious right, which was also extremely militant. So that the religious right came together with the neo-Nazi movement in the United States. And then you had the rise of a rare charismatic leader, Donald Trump. With those three elements, everything that was marginal became mainstreamed. And you had a black swan, unusual event, an anomaly, in which this man was able, in the way of Jim Jones or any other group leader like that, which I, of course, had been studying with my fellow scholars for decades, he began to deceive and mislead and convert a mass population in the United States, which he always referred to as his movement. Like Hitler, he staged rallies. Even when he was president, he staged rallies. And he is, quite frankly, a very antisocial human being whose psychological profile is criminal. So we are now in the throes of this, and unfortunately, the legacy media and the pundits have not kept up with this development. I know a group of scholars that have, but we're sort of working in obscurity in our little laboratories. And the fact is, this was utterly predictable with the rise of Donald Trump.
What's your thought about the end state? When this all comes to rest and we have, say, for example, the G3, and the world has been carved up, what does it look like?
You don't have to go too far back in history before there was any such thing as an idea of democracy. If you want to see the genesis of the idea of democracy, read the pamphlets by Tom Paine in the American Revolution. That is the definition of a democratic movement. And the only country that's carrying that forward right now is Ukraine. Ukraine looks like the United States during the revolutionary times. And Donald Trump, of course, is co-opting the American Revolution and waving the banner of it in his gilded cage in the White House as if, he was the son of liberty. But in fact, it is Zelensky that is carrying this forward, not Donald.
Good point. Good point. So Ben, we've been speaking about the G3 and the carving up the world into a non-liberal world order. But I get a little stuck on the American part of it. So presumably under Trump or his successors in this ideology, in this manifest destiny ideology, the United States would have control over Canada and Mexico. But what about Latin America? What about South America? That's a hard row to hoe. Could that be part of the American section of the G3?
Yeah, I think that's part of it with the Monroe Doctrine vision, on steroids, right? I mean, it's basically all the way down to Chile. I mean, you do have authoritarians where in Argentina, for example, right now, and we've got many, many, many decades of being in South America trying to basically prop up extreme right entities or extreme right governments, militaries, all that. We can go back, talk about Chile, we talk about the generals in both Argentina and in Brazil. I mean, it goes on and on. So we have a long history of intervening in Latin America. So yeah, and then going up north, basically the idea towards the Canadians is absolutely, to grab their wealth. I've visited some places in Canada, by the way, where they're doing extractive industries, and it's like a wound in the land. I know the way I can describe it is it's not the scale of the extraction is so immense that it's like a wound. And for example, the tailings that come off of some of these places, you think you're on the moon. And I've talked with some of my Canadian friends as I've gone through there, kind of appalled. And you definitely get a sense from them of a hurt, a very deep hurt in the way the land is destroyed by the extractive aspects, even though, there's economies and stuff. So, but Trump is basically accelerating that. Alaska becomes just another place that you can grab stuff, and make some money. The forests will be clear cut across the United States. I mean,
Don't forget Greenland.
and Greenland, of course, our friend Greenland there being, getting these rare earths and all that stuff. So, and there isn't there is a view that this is exactly the kind of world also that a lot of his supporters in the tech community want, because they need vast amounts of electricity for their AI. They need all this kind of stuff. So they want, climate change. Don't talk about it, because we need, to have lots of resources and rare earths and all that stuff. So we just will go through everything. The other thing that I just want to say, and this is a hard thing to say, but I do think of it because of the idea of that there be large numbers of people in the United States that will be considered what the Nazis termed useless eaters. And meaning, like, for example, this idea of complicating the life of old people for their social security, where they have to physically go to an office as opposed to doing on the phone or be on the internet, something they're completely incapable, many of them are. It's basically a way of culling old people. And I know that Elon Musk apparently has a great deal of disdain for old people, but also with the advent of AI and all that, there's like whole sectors of work that'll disappear. I was talking with one of my students about being a lawyer in China, and they're, like, if you're going to draft a contract, it's done with AI. All those jobs that would be drafting a contract and all that are now being done with AI, and you can see levels of unemployment without, of course, the support or safety net for it, right? So, and what happens is that people get sick and people die, and there are people, I think, who are just happy with that because it's not them. They've got their little shell, or their big shell is 10% of the top of the population, and they're indifferent to everyone else. Absolutely.
Boy, this is like it's like 1984, isn't it? The
Yeah.
whole thing. It's a new world and a new quality of life, or lack of quality of life, for everyone involved. I want to ask you a last question, Ben, and I'll put the same question to Gene, and that is, accepting the fact, I agree with Gene about this, that the United States is the pivot point. That the United States, however it's governed, whatever kind of foreign policy it adopts now, can determine exactly what kind of new world order we will have, whether it will be liberal or democratic or some other model. And the question I put to you is, if that's so, assuming that's so, how do we, when I say we, I mean all of us, how do we stop the worst result from coming to fruition? How do we stop the fascism, the dictatorship that has gone on, that is going on? What can Congress do? What can the Supreme Court do? What can the people do? Because what we do here will have an effect everywhere in terms of the track of the world order. And I agree with that. So the first question is, do you agree with that? And the second is, what can we do to get off this track to an illiberal world order?
I do agree. And I would just say that just remember that when Biden came into office, he went to Europe and said, America is back. And the Europeans said, yes, but for how long? That was the question for them, And if you saw Trump's speech on March 4th, he was saying, America is back. to start off his speech to Congress, right? And, his version of what is back and Biden's version of what is back, you can imagine the rest of the world is like, for how long any of this? So I would say inside the United States, to the extent, and I know the history is awful, but to the extent, we'll say the ideals of democracy have meaning for people, then part of that is what? The press, assembly, demonstrations, contacting your Congress people, voting, all those kinds of things, and also having legal force, I mean, lawyers and things like that, who can translate those ideals into the courts to hopefully have the courts play the role. Second thing is, I'm a little Madisonian. Okay, you all may think I'm crazy, but I'm a little Madisonian. One of the things I liked about Madison's vision was the dueling sovereigns vision, which you had both separation of powers, but you also had the states and the federal government. And in my view of what happened in the first Trump administration, it was the states that were able to invoke things against the federal government, and they had the sort of sovereign power to counter things that happen. And I've noticed in some of these cases that have been recently being brought, you'll have 16, 17, 18 states are the plaintiffs against the government finding ways to do it. So, a combination of that kind of governmental power in terms of the sovereignty of the states, a combination of actual individual efforts, coalitions, things like that, I think that it can turn the tide. For example, I will make a prediction here today, okay? Elon Musk is on his way out. He is on his way out. And I thought he'd be out a month ago, but he is I'd be surprised if he's around this summer, even with all his money. That's the kind of thing that's going to happen. Why? Because there's this, I don't know if it's centering or what the right term is, but there is this sense of enough parts of the country feel contradictions with supporting the government. For example, if you are a car company and you see the president of the United States advertising a competitor's car at the White House, that has an effect in the boardroom of that car company, GM or Ford or something. So while you were bending the knee, you're like, wait a minute, what, my shareholders are going to say, what the hell are you doing? So that's where my optimism comes, is that the combination of all those things and the stupid mistakes that this government will do, which they're already doing so many already.
Okay. Gene, your thoughts. The fact is that the country's in trouble, and therefore, as a part of that, the world is in trouble. And the world is moving away from a liberal world order, and so is the country. And it isn't easy to change that direction. But your thoughts about how we do that, and can we do that?
My thoughts are based on research I've done 2 years ago and a paper that I've produced, which I hope will be published, because it's harder and harder for scientists and social scientists to get their work published. And what I found out is that when you have this kind of a takeover, an authoritarian takeover, 2/3 of the people will go along with it, no matter what they say, what they believe, what they feel, the tension it produces within them, no matter what their moral codes are, they will obey authority. And that was proven by Stanley Milgram in the 1960s at Yale with a series of 19 experiments on the obedience to authority experiments. But 1/3 of the people will not. Now, of that 1/3, not all will be active. It's the passive people that allow an authoritarian movement and regime to go forward. And that's being tested right now. The only parts of our Madisonian structured government that are really working right now are the courts. They work slowly and inefficiently, and we will see what happens, because if this unitary executive, this strongman, decides he's going to employ federal police forces and the military against court orders, then we know we are in a Reich. But even a Reich as extreme as Hitler's only lasted for 12 years. Well, why did it last for 12 years? Because the United States was aligned against it, and because Russia was so vast and could repel it. But we don't have that today. Now it's the United States and Russia against Europe and against democracy. So that means that our system is either going to hold or fold. And we're going to know the answer to that within a relatively short amount of time. And if we come out of this the way we came into it in the last election, yes, the world will be reconstructed and there will be something else in place, not the Pax Americana, and it will more likely be something violent. And that's true in the United States if a resistance is not able to become a viable resistance, then we will also see violence in the United States. So we'll know pretty soon, and it's scary. People are frightened. Even people who elected Trump are frightened, and they don't want to watch the news. But this is the time you have to be present. You have to direct your gaze directly at what is happening. You have to decide not to cooperate. Schumer was an example of how to cooperate because he thought we're just in a normal systemic political situation. He doesn't realize that we have an extreme, basically Nazi coup that's gone on, and he's not part of the resistance. So we have to get rid of the leadership that is basically a Munich-based leadership, a Chamberlain-type leadership. We need new leaders to emerge, and we need them to be clear-headed and clear-eyed as to exactly what we're facing, to define it in simple terms to that 1/3 of the population that is listening, and to mobilize an effective resistance.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. What a very valuable discussion. Thank you so much to our co-host, Ben Davis, and our esteemed guest, Gene Rosenfeld. I'm Jay Fidell, host of Keeping the World Company. We've been discussing how far down the path are we to the end of the liberal world order. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha.